On the night of April 14th, 1912, the richest man on board the Titanic stood on the deck of a sinking ship and put his pregnant 19-year-old wife into a lifeboat. Her name was Madeline, and she was 30 years younger than him, and their marriage had already scandalized the country before the ship ever left port. Witnesses later said he calmly lit a cigarette as the deck tilted beneath him, helped his young wife into Lifeboat 4, and asked the crew for permission to climb in beside her, since she was, after all, in a delicate condition. The answer was no. Women and children first, the officer told him, and John Jacob Astor IV, worth somewhere close to $2 billion in today's money, stepped back from the railing into a crowd of drowning men and waited. His body was recovered a week later by a cable ship sent out specifically to search for him. His watch stopped, a diamond ring still on his finger, his pockets stuffed with more than $2,000 in cash and gold. That is where this story could end, a rich man's death in the coldest water in the world, one of the most famous casualties of the deadliest peacetime disaster in maritime history. Instead, it is only the first of two disasters that would hit this family 90 years apart, and the second one did not happen on the ocean. It happened in a Manhattan courtroom when an old woman's own son stood trial for stealing from her while she was slipping into dementia, too confused to know her own fortune was disappearing. Same family name, same original fortune. Two separate collapses, a full century apart, and the same exact failure sitting underneath both of them. To understand how a single family produces a Titanic tragedy and a nursing home-style theft scandal 100 years later, you have to go back to the man who built the whole thing, because nobody handed John Jacob Astor a fortune either. He arrived in America from Germany in 1784 with almost nothing, and he went into the fur trade, buying pelts from trappers and selling them for a profit that kept climbing as his network kept growing. Furs made him rich. Real estate made him the richest man in America. He took the profits from fur and poured them into Manhattan land, buying up farms and lots across an island that was about to explode in value, and he had the patience to simply hold on to it while the city grew up around him. By the time he died in 1848, John Jacob Astor owned a staggering slice of New York City itself, and his estate was valued at around $20 million, a fortune so large for its era that newspapers struggled to describe it. He left almost all of it to one son, William Backhouse Astor, the same concentration move the smart founders always make. For one more generation, the fortune held together and grew. Then it started to split, the way these things always do, and every split came wrapped in a family feud loud enough to make the newspapers. The first crack ran straight through the family's own home. By the 1890s, the Astor name in New York belonged, in the public's mind, to one woman. Caroline Astor, the wife of William Backhouse Astor Jr., had crowned herself the Queen of New York society, and her list of exactly 400 acceptable guests, the number her ballroom could hold, decided who counted as somebody in the richest city in the country. Her nephew, a lawyer and diplomat named William Waldorf Astor, wanted that same social throne for his own wife, and Caroline refused to hand it over, treating his branch of the family as second-tier Astors who would never sit above her. So William did something almost nobody does over a family argument. He tore down his own mansion right next door to his aunt's house on Fifth Avenue, and in its place, he built a 13-story luxury hotel, deliberately positioned to throw shadows and noise directly onto his aunt's front door, its kitchen smells and delivery carts rattling past her windows every morning. He named it the Waldorf. It was a skyscraper built purely out of spite, and it worked exactly as intended, driving Caroline out of the neighborhood entirely within a few years. Her son, John Jacob Astor IV, refused to let the insult stand. He tore down his own mother's now vacated mansion and built an even taller hotel right beside his cousin's, called the Astoria, engineered to be taller and grander than the Waldorf next door, a direct architectural insult aimed straight back at his own cousin. Two men who shared a great-grandfather spent years locked in an open, public feud fought entirely through concrete and steel, each building rising specifically to overshadow the others. Eventually, the two men called a truce and merged the buildings into a single hotel connected by a corridor nicknamed Peacock Alley, and the Waldorf Astoria was born, the most famous hotel in America, constructed entirely out of a family fight that had nothing to do with hospitality and everything to do with pride. William Waldorf Astor did not stay in America to enjoy the peace. He hated the press coverage of his own wealth so intensely and lost a New York political race so badly that in 1890 he announced America was no longer fit to live in and moved his entire fortune to England. He bought castles, bought a British newspaper empire, and eventually bought himself a title, becoming Viscount Astor, the first American to renounce his own country's society to go build a fresh one inside the British aristocracy instead. That branch of the family, the Astors of England, would go on to produce Nancy Astor, the first woman ever to sit in the British Parliament. But that is a story for a different video. What matters here is that the fortune had already split once, physically, across an entire ocean before the 20th century had even started, one branch staying in New York, one branch reinventing itself as British nobility, both of them still spending under the same five-letter name. Back in New York, John Jacob Astor IV kept building his own reputation as recklessly as he built hotels. He was brilliant in strange, restless ways, holding patents, writing a science fiction novel, inventing a bicycle brake, and a device for producing gas from peat. And in 1909, at the age of 46, he blew up his own social standing entirely. He divorced his wife of 18 years, Ava Willing, the mother of his children, in a split so public and so bitter that the New York papers ran it for weeks, and within a year, he was courting a teenager, Madeline Talmadge Force, who was barely older than his own daughter and younger than his own son. New York high society, the same world his mother Caroline had once ruled by strict invitation list, turned on him instantly, closing its doors to the man whose own family had once decided who was allowed through them. Divorce alone was scandalous enough in that era to end a person's social life. Marrying a woman 30 years his junior, barely out of her teens, straight out of finishing school, was treated as a genuine moral crisis, covered breathlessly by every newspaper in the country, with editorials openly questioning his judgment and his morals. The backlash was so severe that Astor and his new bride left the country for an extended honeymoon in Europe and Egypt, waiting out an entire winter for the scandal to cool before daring to come home at all. Madeline was pregnant with their child when they finally booked passage back to New York in April of 1912 on the newest, largest, most luxurious ship ever built, hoping a quiet, comfortable Atlantic crossing might ease them back into a country that had spent the past 2 years mocking them in print. It was called the Titanic, and it was supposed to be the safest, most graceful way home from a scandal. Instead, it became the most famous disaster in maritime history, and John Jacob Astor IV, the richest passenger aboard, did not survive it. Here is the part almost nobody talks about because the ship gets all the attention and the money gets none of it. Astor's death did not just end a life, it detonated the fortune. His will left the overwhelming majority of his estate to his 16-year-old son from his first marriage, William Vincent Astor, while Madeline, his young widow, received a fixed trust income and the family's New York mansion, but only until she remarried, at which point even that would be stripped away. She did remarry within a few years and lost her claim precisely as the will demanded, walking away with a fraction of what a full inheritance might have provided. The son inherited a colossal fortune at 16, a boy suddenly running one of the largest private estates in America, guided by trustees rather than by any Astor who actually understood the business the way old John Jacob had understood the fur trade. Vincent Astor spent decades trying to modernize the family's real estate holdings, but he never remarried a fortune builder's discipline to the family name the way his great-great-grandfather had. When Vincent died in 1959, his third wife, a much younger woman named Brooke Russell Marshall, inherited the lion's share of what remained, along with control of the Astor Foundation. And Brooke Astor is where this story's second disaster begins, 70 years after the first one drowned in the Atlantic. Brooke Astor spent decades as one of the most beloved philanthropists in New York, giving away well over $200 million to libraries, parks, and the city's poorest neighborhoods, running the Astor Foundation with a personal, hands-on generosity that made her genuinely famous for kindness rather than scandal. She lived to be 105 years old, and for most of that century-plus life, she was, by every account, sharp, gracious, and firmly in control of her own affairs. It was only in her final years, as dementia began stealing her memory, that the second Astor disaster started quietly inside her own home, run not by an outside con artist, but by her own son. Her son, Anthony Marshall, had spent his life a step behind his mother's fame, and as Brooke's mind began to fail in her late 90s and early hundreds, he moved in. Prosecutors would later lay out, in devastating detail, exactly what happened next. Marshall got his declining, disoriented mother to sign a series of new wills and amendments called codicils that redirected enormous sums away from the charities Brooke Astor had spent her life supporting and funneled them instead toward himself. He sold one of her most treasured paintings, a Childe Hassam landscape, for $10 million and pocketed a $2 million commission on the sale for himself without her informed consent. Household staff and family friends began reporting what they were seeing inside the house. An elderly woman in a stained bathrobe, kept on a couch with torn upholstery, her beloved dogs sold off, her care quietly downgraded while the money that should have paid for better care moved somewhere else. Her own grandson, Brooke's grandson, through a different branch, took the almost unthinkable step of suing his own father, Anthony Marshall, to have Brooke Astor declared incompetent and removed from his control. It became a courtroom war fought in public, with a 104-year-old woman's mental state debated in front of cameras, while her own blood accused her own son of exploiting her. Brooke Astor died in 2007, and 2 years later, Anthony Marshall stood trial in a Manhattan courtroom on charges that included grand larceny and scheming to defraud his own dementia-stricken mother. The trial ran for months, one of the longest and most closely watched criminal cases in New York in years, filled with testimony from doctors, household staff, and family friends, painting a picture of systematic financial abuse dressed up as filial devotion. Prosecutors told the jury that Marshall had exploited a woman who, by the final years of her life, sometimes did not recognize her own bedroom, coaxing her signature onto documents she could no longer meaningfully understand. His own son, Brooke's grandson, took the stand against him, describing a grandmother left cold and neglected in a house that could easily have afforded her every comfort. In October of 2009, a jury convicted him on 14 of the 16 counts against him. He was sentenced to 1 to 3 years in prison, an 85-year-old man, frail enough that he eventually had to appeal for early release on medical grounds, led away for stealing from his own 105-year-old mother, the final heir of the Astor name, convicted of exploiting the very fortune his ancestors had built by fur pelts and Manhattan land 2 centuries earlier. The Astor Foundation, the charitable machine Brooke had run with such personal care, had its assets stripped and scattered through legal battles rather than passed down whole to any functioning next generation. There was no next generation left running anything. There was only a criminal case, a wrecked reputation, and an estate torn apart in court rather than distributed with any dignity at all. Look at the shape of the whole 2-century arc, and the pattern becomes impossible to miss. John Jacob Astor built the machine, land, and patience, and concentrated it in one heir the way every smart founder does. The very next generation split it in two, one branch fleeing across an ocean to reinvent itself as British nobility, the other staying in New York to fight over hotels built purely out of wounded pride. A generation after that, a reckless, headline-chasing remarriage put the family's public reputation on a collision course with the biggest maritime disaster in history, and the fortune passed to a teenage heir raised by trustees instead of by any Astor who had ever built anything with his own hands. And a full century after the ship went down, the very last chapter of the story was not a sinking ship at all. It was an old woman's own son standing in a courthouse, convicted of stealing from her while her mind slipped away, the machine long gone, nothing left to protect but a name and a caretaker with easy access to a dying woman's signature. That is the real link between the two disasters, the one almost nobody draws out loud. A ship cannot be blamed for sinking. A son cannot entirely be excused for stealing, but both catastrophes landed on this family precisely because nobody across 5 generations ever built the boring, unglamorous protective structure that keeps a fortune and the people attached to it safe from a single catastrophic event, whether that event is an iceberg or a declining mind exploited by the person closest to it. The DuPonts built a holding company, the Rockefellers built trusts, and a family office designed to survive exactly this kind of vulnerability. The Astors built hotels to spite each other and left an elderly woman's care to the same relative who controlled her checkbook. When John Jacob Astor IV's ship went down, there was no structure strong enough to keep the family's next chapter from being run by teenage inheritance and absent stewardship. When Brooke Astor's mind went, there was no structure strong enough to keep her own son's hands off her signature. Different centuries, different weapons, same undefended fortune. There is a strange, quiet postscript worth sitting with. The Waldorf Astoria, the hotel born out of spite between two feuding cousins, is still standing today, one of the most famous addresses in New York, having long since outlived every Astor who fought over its construction. The building the family built to humiliate each other has survived every single disaster that hit the people who built it. The hotel remembers nothing. It just keeps renting rooms. And somewhere in that fact sits the whole lesson of this family twice over. A structure built out of spite still outlasted a fortune built out of love. Because a hotel, unlike an heir, cannot be fooled, drowned, or talked out of its own inheritance. The Astors built the one thing in their empire that could survive them, almost by accident, while arguing about something that never mattered at all.